I want to think carefully about silence and specifically about the relationship between silence and money, because it is one of the least understood and most consequential relationships in the whole of a person's financial life. There is a deep and almost universal human impulse to speak about what we are doing, to announce our intentions, to share our progress, to tell the people around us about the moves we are making. And this impulse, which feels entirely natural and even virtuous, is one of the quietest and most reliable ways that people undermine their own financial trajectory. The moves that actually build and preserve wealth are almost without exception moves that are best made in silence. And the difficulty most people have is not in understanding which moves to make, but in resisting the powerful pull to talk about them, to seek validation for them, to convert the private act of building into the public act of announcing. Let me be careful about what I mean by silence, because I want to clear away two misreadings immediately. I do not mean secrecy in any furtive or shameful sense, and I certainly do not mean concealment of anything you're obligated to disclose. Silence, as I am using it, is not about hiding from anyone to whom you owe honesty. It is about strategic discretion, about the deliberate choice not to broadcast your financial life into your social world, not to signal, not to announce, not to hand out the information and the edge and the intentions that are, when kept private, a genuine source of advantage and security, and that become, when broadcast, a source of friction and envy and competition and the quiet dissipation of the very energy that would otherwise have gone into building. And I equally do not mean the opposite extreme, the paranoid secrecy of the person who trusts no one and lives in defensive isolation. What I mean is the calm, deliberate, strategic quiet of the person who understands that their financial moves are strengthened by discretion and weakened by broadcast, and who therefore simply keeps them to themselves, without drama and without anxiety, as a matter of ordinary prudence. The reason silence is so powerful, and the reason the impulse to break it is so dangerous, comes down to a set of structural realities that I want to walk through by looking at the specific moves that most reward being kept quiet. Because the principle is best understood not in the abstract, but through the actual financial moves, whose entire effectiveness depends on the discipline of not talking about them. The first move that must be kept in silence is the accumulation of ownership. The single most important thing a person can do to build genuine wealth, as against merely earning income, is to quietly accumulate ownership of things that compound: equity in enterprises, stakes in productive assets, pieces of things that grow while you sleep. And this accumulation should be done in silence for two distinct reasons that both matter. The first is psychological, and it is subtle and genuinely important. When you announce what you are building, when you tell people about the ownership you are accumulating and the plans you have, you receive immediately and at no cost a small hit of the social validation that the actual achievement would eventually have provided. And that premature hit of validation quietly discharges some of the very drive that would have powered the building. The mind treats the announcement as a partial accomplishment, feels a portion of the satisfaction in advance, and the pressure to actually complete the thing is subtly relieved. The people who talk most about what they are going to build are very often precisely the people who never build it, not because they were dishonest, but because the talking itself absorbed the energy that the doing required. Silence preserves the tension, the unrelieved drive that building demands. The second reason is that visible ownership invites claims. The moment the people around you know what you own, you become the object of 100 small and large expectations, requests, comparisons, resentments, and involvements that constrain your freedom to act and that attach a social cost to every subsequent move. Quiet ownership is free ownership. Announced ownership comes with a crowd attached. The second move that must be kept in silence is the maintenance of a genuine gap between what you have and what you appear to have. which is to say, the discipline of letting your wealth remain invisible. This is one of the most counterintuitive truths in all of personal finance, and it runs directly against the deepest instincts of a status-driven species. Real wealth is, almost by definition, the wealth you do not see. It is the money that was not spent, the consumption that was foregone, the assets that were accumulated quietly instead of being converted into visible signals of success. The person who looks wealthy, who drives the visible car and wears the visible watch and lives in the visibly impressive way, is very often a person who is converting wealth into signal as fast as they acquire it, dissipating the very thing they appear to possess. And the person who is genuinely, durably wealthy very often looks entirely ordinary because they understood that every unit of wealth converted into a visible signal is a unit removed from the compounding base, and that the appearance of wealth and the reality of wealth are not merely different but frequently opposed. To keep your wealth invisible is to keep it working, to keep it compounding, and to keep yourself free of the enormous and escalating social pressure to consume that visible wealth invariably generates. The signal is expensive, and it is expensive twice over. Once in the direct cost of the thing, and again in the compounding, it forgoes and the escalating expectations. It sets in motion these first principles, the quiet accumulation of ownership and the invisible nature of genuine wealth, are worth studying as part of a connected understanding of how durable wealth is actually built rather than as isolated tips. And there is a body of work that lays out these principles carefully and systematically, called the Naval Codex, CTA 1. It is not a set of tactics, and it is not a lifestyle prescription. It is a systematic account of the underlying principles that determine who accumulates genuine long-term wealth and who merely earns and consumes and signals, of how leverage and specific knowledge and ownership interact to produce a durable position rather than a temporary appearance. If you are serious about these questions, engaging with the principles directly is far more valuable than any individual move, because the principles hold across every particular circumstance, and the particulars will always change. The third move that must be kept in silence is the protection of your genuine edge, your specific knowledge, the particular competitive advantage that you have developed and that produces your outsized returns. This is perhaps the most straightforwardly strategic of all the silences, and it follows from one of the most basic laws of markets, which is that value comes from rarity. Whatever genuine edge you possess, whatever specific knowledge or method or insight allows you to produce more value or capture more return than the people around you, is valuable precisely to the extent that it is rare, precisely to the extent that others do not have it or do not understand it. And the moment you broadcast it, the moment you explain your actual method and share your genuine insight widely, you begin the process of competing it away, of eroding the very rarity that made it valuable. There is a strong and understandable impulse to share what we know, to be seen as knowledgeable, to receive the recognition that comes from demonstrating our insight. And that impulse, indulged, is the steady dismantling of the edge that produces the returns. The person with a genuine edge speaks about it least, not out of stinginess, but out of a clear understanding that the edge and its broadcast are incompatible, that an advantage explained is an advantage on its way to disappearing. You can share the general and the philosophical freely, because the general and the philosophical are not the edge. The edge is the specific, and the specific is what silence protects. The fourth move that must be kept in silence, and this is the one that requires the most conviction to make, is the quiet repositioning of your wealth from the side of the system that is being drained to the side that is being carried along. We live within a debt-based monetary system in which the supply of money expands over time, and that expansion flows first into assets, bidding up the prices of the things that owners own, while wages and cash savings lag and quietly erode. The person who holds their wealth in wages and cash is being diluted continuously and silently, their purchasing power flowing away toward those who hold assets. And the correct response, the response that preserves and builds wealth across this monetary reality is to move deliberately from holding wages and cash to holding genuine assets, to cross from the diluted side to the side that is carried along by the expansion. This move must be made in silence for a reason that connects directly to one of the deepest principles of intelligent positioning, which is that the value of any repositioning is highest when it is made before the crowd makes it and lowest when everyone is making it simultaneously. The move against the crowd, made early, while the structural reality is visible to the attentive but not yet obvious to everyone, is the advantageous move, and it is advantageous precisely because it is not yet crowded. To broadcast it, to announce your repositioning and explain your reasoning to everyone around you is to invite two costs: the incomprehension and disapproval of those who do not yet see the structure and who will experience your move as strange or reckless, and the gradual crowding of the very position you are quietly taking. The intelligent repositioning is done quietly, early, and with the equanimity to act on your own analysis without needing anyone around you to validate or even understand it. The way capital actually moves during these monetary shifts, where it flows and why, and what happens to different kinds of assets when the monetary order itself begins to change, is worth understanding in its specific mechanics rather than in vague outline. And there is a framework that traces exactly this, called the Dragon Pivot. CTA2, despite the name, it is not really about any single country. It is about how monetary transitions unfold across history, what they do to different asset positions, and how those who understood them early positioned their wealth quietly to survive the discontinuity rather than be diluted by it. If the structure I am describing concerns you, and for anyone holding their wealth primarily in wages and cash, it genuinely should, that is where the fuller historical picture lives, and it is exactly the kind of understanding best acquired quietly and acted upon before it becomes the obvious move that everyone is making at once. The fifth move that must be kept in silence is the patient direction of your capital into genuinely productive assets rather than into the appearance of wealth or into speculation dressed up as investment. There is a crucial distinction between assets whose value is grounded in genuine productive capability, in the creation of real value for real people, and assets whose value is merely a claim on a strained system or a bet on a rising price with nothing real beneath it. The move that builds durable wealth is the quiet, patient accumulation of the former, of equity in enterprises that produce genuine value, of intellectual property that generates real returns, of carefully selected real assets grounded in genuine and ongoing demand. And this must be done in silence for a reason that is partly strategic and partly protective of your own judgment. The strategic reason is that the genuinely good, productive opportunities are rarely the ones that everyone is talking about, and the act of seeking validation for your choices tends to pull you toward the crowded, the popular, the socially approved, and away from the quiet, unglamorous, genuinely productive opportunities that the crowd has not yet noticed. The protective reason is that broadcasting your investment choices subjects your own judgment to the enormous distorting pressure of other people's opinions, fears, and enthusiasms, and the person who is constantly explaining and defending their choices to others is a person whose choices are being shaped by the need to explain and defend rather than by clear, independent analysis. Silence protects the independence of judgment that genuine investing requires. The work of distinguishing genuinely productive assets from merely financially engineered ones, and of building a position out of real productive capability and real institutional protection rather than out of speculation or the appearance of wealth, is worth doing systematically and quietly rather than reactively and in public. And there is a framework devoted precisely to that called the Sovereign Vault. CTA 3. It is concerned with building durable, generationally significant wealth grounded in things that produce genuine value in the world rather than in the financial engineering that looks like wealth in favorable conditions and dissolves in unfavorable ones. for anyone who is serious about building something that lasts and that is meant to be quietly held and compounded rather than displayed, that is the fuller treatment of the question. The sixth move that must be kept in silence is the development of genuine optionality, the quiet building of real alternatives across the important dimensions of your economic life before you need them. Optionality is one of the most undervalued assets a person can possess. The genuine possession of meaningful choices among real alternatives, the freedom that comes from not being forced by circumstance to accept the terms of any single arrangement, any single dependency, any single set of constraints. And the deep principle of optionality is that it is most cheaply acquired in advance and most expensively acquired under duress. The person who quietly develops their alternatives, who builds the skills and the relationships and the structures and the resources that would give them genuine choices before they are forced to, is in a qualitatively different position than the person who begins developing them reactively once the constraint has already closed in. And this development must be done quietly for reasons that are by now familiar. Announced optionality invites the friction and the resistance of the people whose expectations depend on your remaining where you are, and the premature announcement of alternatives you have not yet built discharges the drive to build them and invites resistance before you are strong enough to withstand it. The person quietly building their options accumulates genuine freedom. The person announcing their intention to build options accumulates only opposition and the false satisfaction of having spoken. Optionality is built in silence and revealed, if it is revealed at all, only when it is already secure. And the seventh move that must be kept in silence is perhaps the hardest of all, because it is not a single act, but a sustained discipline extended across a long period, and that is the discipline of remaining quiet through the long, flat years of compounding. Everything that genuinely compounds, every asset and skill and body of work of real durable value, produces almost nothing visible in its early period. The curve is nearly flat at the beginning. All of the reward, all of the steepness, all of the vindication arrives later, after the accumulated base has grown enough that the returns begin to generate returns and the growth turns nonlinear. And the flat early period, which can last for years, is precisely where the pull to break silence is strongest, because you have been working and building and you have little visible to show for it. And the temptation to announce, to seek encouragement, to convert the invisible progress into some form of visible social acknowledgement is enormous. But the announcement in this phase is doubly dangerous. It discharges the drive you most need to sustain, and it invites the doubt and the discouragement of others who see, quite accurately, that you have little visible to show, and whose doubt, expressed at exactly the moment your own conviction is most fragile, is very often what ends the whole endeavor. The loudest people are very reliably the ones in the early and unproductive phase, seeking through noise the validation that results have not yet provided. The quiet ones are very often the ones who are actually compounding, who understood that the flat years must be endured in silence, without the crutch of external validation, until the curve finally bends. The discipline to stay silent through the long, unglamorous middle, to keep building when there is nothing to show and no applause to be had, is itself the discipline that allows the compounding to complete. And it is the rarest of all the silences precisely because it is the longest and the least immediately rewarded. Now, I want to draw these seven together because beneath all of them there is a single principle, and it is worth stating plainly. The principle is that silence is itself a form of leverage and a form of security. It is leverage because the moves that build wealth are strengthened by discretion and weakened by broadcast, because the edge preserved in silence retains its value, while the edge announced is competed away, because the drive preserved in silence powers the building, while the drive discharged in announcement dissipates. And it is security, because the wealth kept invisible is free of the claims and the envy and the escalating pressures that visible wealth invariably attracts, because the quiet accumulator is free of the friction that the broadcaster must constantly manage. Silence is not a minor stylistic preference in the building of wealth. It is a genuine strategic and structural advantage, available to anyone, costing nothing, and requiring only the discipline to resist one of the deepest and most universal of human impulses. And I want to be honest, as I always try to be, about why this is so hard. Because understanding that silence is advantageous does almost nothing to make it easy. And most people who understand the principle perfectly will nonetheless break their silence again and again. And it is worth understanding why. The difficulty is not a lack of information. The difficulty is that the impulse to announce, to share, to seek validation, to convert private progress into public acknowledgement is one of the most powerful drives in a social species, wired deep, operating beneath conscious control, and it is enormously amplified by a modern environment that rewards broadcasting with immediate and measurable social feedback, that has built entire systems around the conversion of every private moment into a public signal that trains us continuously to share everything and to measure our lives by the response. To remain silent about your financial moves in such an environment is to resist not merely an internal impulse, but an entire external machinery built to draw that impulse out of you and reward it. It is genuinely difficult, and the difficulty is not a weakness of character, but the natural friction of going quietly against both a deep instinct and a loud environment at the same time. So I want to end not with an exhortation, but with an invitation to see the principle clearly, because this is, in the end, one of the oldest pieces of wisdom there is, understood by every tradition that ever took seriously the question of how a person builds something lasting. The quiet accumulate and the loud dissipate. What is done in silence compounds, and what is announced is spent in the very act of announcing. This is not new. What is new is only the circumstance, an environment engineered to make silence harder than it has ever been, to reward broadcast at every turn, to convert the deep human impulse to share into a constant and measured and rewarded stream of signal. Against that environment, the deliberate, calm, strategic choice to keep your financial moves in silence is a genuine and increasingly rare advantage, and it is available to anyone willing to endure the discomfort of not being witnessed. Accumulate ownership quietly. Let your wealth stay invisible. Guard your genuine edge. Reposition early and without announcement. Build real productive assets away from the crowd. Develop your optionality before you reveal it, if you reveal it at all. And above all, endure the long, flat years of compounding in silence, without the crutch of validation until the curve finally bends. None of these is done in a single dramatic act. They are done quietly over a long time in the accumulation of many small choices to build rather than to announce, to compound rather than to signal, to keep the tension rather than to discharge it. And the result of that sustained quiet, invisible for so long, arrives when it finally arrives, the way these things always do, slowly and then suddenly, revealed at last as the genuine and durable wealth that the loud, seeking their validation in advance, spent long ago in the very act of speaking about it,